I want you to imagine coming home from a joyous celebration.
Right.
You are surrounded by the safety of your family, your closest friends, just basking in the glow of a major life milestone.
Exactly.
And you return to the sanctuary of your own home, you lock the doors, and you settle in for the night.
You go through all your normal routines.
Yeah, you take off your makeup, you fold your clothes, you prepare for sleep.
And then before the sun even rises, you just vanish.
You leave without a single trace. You abandon all your worldly possessions, your vehicles, your money, your protective family dog, and, even the clothes you literally plan to wear the very next day.
It is a scenario that fundamentally shatters our baseline assumption of security. I mean, the home is universally understood to be our ultimate safe haven.
Right, absolutely.
We lock our doors to keep the unpredictability of the outside world at bay. So when individuals simply cease to be...
just vanishing from within their own walls.
Yes, vanishing without any obvious sign of forced entry or a violent struggle, it creates a terrifying rupture in reality.
It really does. It leaves a void that is profoundly unsettling because it forces you to confront just how fragile that illusion of safety truly is.
It really does.
And that unsettling void is exactly what we are confronting today. Our mission in this comprehensive exploration is to methodically reconstruct the timeline, the physical evidence, and the haunting theories surrounding the unsolved 1992 disappearance of the Springfield Three in Missouri.
It's a massive undertaking.
It is. We are going to trace this narrative from that fateful night all the way to the present day in 2026.
And I want to note that today's detailed investigation is built from a really dense stack of historical case files, official police reports, and decades of journalistic chronologies.
Right, we're relying strictly on the documented facts.
Exactly. We're going to examine the undeniable facts, the tragic missteps, and the complex shadows of doubt that have lingered over this community for more than 3 decades.
So to truly comprehend the magnitude of the absence these women left behind, you really must first have a vivid understanding of who they were as living, breathing people.
Yeah, we are looking at 3 distinct, vibrant lives, all intersecting on a night meant for celebration.
Right. Before we get into the mechanisms of the investigation, we need to establish their baselines. First, there was Sherrill Elizabeth Levitt.
She was 47 years old at the time of her disappearance.
And she worked as a cosmetologist at a bustling local salon.
That detail is actually incredibly important.
How so?
Well, a cosmetologist's profession is built entirely on strict routines, scheduled appointments, and constant public interaction. You do not just skip a Saturday shift at a salon without alerting a dozen people.
Oh, that makes total sense. Her absence would be noticed immediately.
Right. And physically, she was petite. She stood right around 5 feet tall, with short, light blonde hair.
And as I go through the case files, there is one particular habit of Sherrill's that investigators continuously point back to as a massive forensic anchor.
Yes, her smoking habit.
Exactly. She was known to her friends, her clients, and her family as a completely dedicated, uncompromising chain smoker.
And that habit becomes a really crucial data point later on. Furthermore, Sherrill was a single mother. The historical records and interviews with friends continually emphasize her incredibly close, protective bond with her daughter.
Right. They lived together, they relied on each other, and their lives were just deeply intertwined.
That daughter was Suzanne Elizabeth Streeter, though everyone just knew her as Suzie.
Right, Suzie. She was 19 years old.
Yeah, Suzie had shoulder-length blonde hair and brown eyes.
When you examine the missing persons flyers that eventually plaster the entire Midwest, you see investigators desperately relying on specific identifying marks, right?
Oh, absolutely. Hoping a hospital clerk or a gas station attendant might spot her.
Right. She had a distinct scar on her upper right forearm and a small, noticeable mole on the left corner of her mouth.
She was essentially standing right at the crossroads of her life, transitioning from the structure of high school into the total freedom of young adulthood.
And completing this trio was Stacy Kathleen McCall, who was 18 years old.
She was Susie's close friend and confidant.
And when you read the statements from Stacy's family and her teachers, a very clear behavioral pattern emerges. The records consistently describe her as highly responsible, almost cautious by nature.
Yeah, she had long, dark blonde hair and light-colored eyes. She was a young woman who meticulously kept her family informed of her whereabouts.
She checked in, she asked permission.
Exactly. That established baseline of responsibility makes her sudden silence all the more alarming. It directly contradicts everything her family knew about how she navigated the world.
So the milestone that ultimately brought Suzie and Stacy together that weekend occurred on June 6, 1992.
It was a Saturday.
Right, a Saturday. The two girls graduated from Kickapoo High School. The ceremony took place inside the Hammond Student Center right at 4 p.m.
It was a massive, joyous event. Sherrill Levitt was right there in the audience, watching her daughter cross that stage to receive her diploma.
Following the ceremony, Stacy spent the late afternoon having photographs taken with her customized graduation cake, and she even received a Cocker Spaniel puppy as a graduation gift. Yeah, I mean, it was an afternoon characterized by absolute normalcy, familial warmth, and just total optimism for the future.
Right. But when detectives look at an event like a disappearance, they do not just see a single bad night. They meticulously trace back the dozens of tiny, entirely normal choices that led up to it.
The butterfly effect, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is vital to unpack the chain of decisions that followed that graduation ceremony.
Right.
The high school administrators, anticipating the risks associated with graduation night, actually offered a safe, highly supervised, alcohol-free lock-in event inside the school building.
It was designed to keep the graduates in one secure location until 8 a.m. the following morning, right?
Yes, but both Suzie and Stacy declined to attend.
Which, honestly, is probably what most 18-year-olds would do.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the idea of being locked in a gymnasium with chaperones on the very night you are supposed to be celebrating your newfound freedom is a pretty tough sell.
Exactly. It is an entirely typical behavioral response for that demographic. There is a fierce teenage desire for independence, a feeling of invulnerability that peaks right on graduation night.
Right, they wanted to celebrate on their own terms.
They wanted to navigate a series of private house parties rather than submitting to a school-sanctioned itinerary.
But that perfectly normal desire for autonomy set them on a path outside the protective umbrella of the school and their parents.
It did. Now, the original plan for that evening was actually quite specific. Suzie, Stacy, and another close friend named Janelle Kirby intended to spend the evening visiting various parties.
And then late that night, drive down to a motel in Branson, Missouri.
Right. The idea was to spend the night in the motel and then wake up and meet a larger group of friends the next morning at a local water park called Whitewater.
But that plan shifted. At approximately 10 p.m., amidst the noise of a graduation party, Stacy found a landline and called her mother, Janice McCall, to check in.
And Janice was understandably worried.
Oh, of course. You have a mix of massive graduation parties, the inevitable presence of alcohol, and a proposed late-night drive down a dark highway to Branson.
Because of her mother's stern concerns, Stacy actually agreed to cancel the out-of-town drive.
We really need to pause and look at the mechanics of that 10 p.m. phone call because it is a critical data point for law enforcement.
It really is. In 1992, communicating required effort. You had to physically find a telephone, dial the number, and have a direct conversation.
Right. No text messages back then.
Exactly. This action establishes that Stacy was not only communicative, but entirely compliant with her mother's boundaries.
Janice McCall later stated that a new, safer plan was forged during that very call.
They agreed that the girls would stay local in Springfield.
And there was a strict verbal understanding that the group would reconvene between 8:00 and 8:30 the next morning to head to the water park during daylight hours.
That detail is exactly what makes this case so baffling to me.
Right. I mean, it sounds like Stacy was incredibly responsible. She is actively finding a phone at a party, calling her mom, and dynamically updating the itinerary based on parental concern.
She's doing everything right.
So how does a night rooted in such cautious, transparent communication end in total, deafening silence?
Well, it starkly illustrates the sheer limits of parental protection. Janice McCall did everything correctly by establishing parameters. Stacy did everything correctly by communicating and actively altering her plans to stay safe.
So what does that tell investigators?
What this tells investigators is that the disruption to their lives later that night was a sudden, overwhelming external force.
It wasn't them just running off.
No, absolutely not. It was not the result of a reckless teenage decision, a joyride gone wrong, or an intentional runaway scenario. They were operating firmly within a framework of safety and accountability.
While the girls were out navigating the various graduation parties in the area, we have to look at how Sherrill spent her evening. Her night provides an incredible contrast to the loud celebrations of her daughter. Sherrill actually declined an invitation to have dinner with Janelle Kirby's family after the graduation ceremony.
Instead, she went straight home to her residence at 1717 East Delmar Street.
She was last heard from at approximately 11:15 p.m., having a perfectly quiet domestic night.
She was just speaking with a friend on the phone about how she was spending the evening stripping, painting, and varnishing an old armoire in her bedroom.
So we are essentially establishing two parallel timelines that are slowly winding toward an intersection.
Right. You have the quiet, isolated domesticity of Sherrill Levitt settling into her home for the night, engaged in a mundane household task.
And you have the transient celebratory movement of Suzie and Stacy moving from one bustling location to another.
The timeline completely fractures when we transition from the noise of those graduation parties to the eerie, still silence of the early morning hours.
The girls' night of celebrating effectively came to a close when the Springfield police were called for a noise complaint and broke up a large party at the home of a classmate named Michelle Elder.
That happened at exactly 1:50 a.m.
Right. By 2 a.m., Suzie, Stacy, and their friend Janelle Kirby left the dispersed party and drove to Janelle's house in the nearby town of Battlefield.
The revised plan was to simply sleep there.
But when they arrived, Janelle's house was packed. Visiting relatives who had come from out of town for the graduation were sleeping in the spare beds and on the couches.
There simply wasn't enough room for 3 more teenagers to crash.
This is a monumental pivot point in the sequence of events.
It really is. It is a tiny logistical hurdle, just a crowded house, but it changes the entire geography of the night.
Finding no space to sleep, Suzie suggested a new alternative, going back to her house on Delmar Street.
And she used a very specific, mundane detail to convince Stacy. She mentioned wanting to show off her newly delivered king-sized waterbed.
A king-size waterbed in 1992 was a big deal for a teenager.
Oh, totally.
It was a novelty, like a status symbol. It makes perfect sense why that would be the draw to change locations at 2 in the morning.
Exactly. It roots their decision-making in intensely normal human behavior. Janelle's mother, Kathy, was actually already in bed, but was awake enough to overhear this brief exchange in the hallway.
She clearly heard Suzie tell Stacy to follow her to the Delmar house in her own car, and she heard Stacy agree to the new plan.
And we know definitively that they made it to 1717 East Delmar.
We do. The physical evidence of their arrival was practically scattered all over the interior of the house.
When investigators eventually secured and analyzed the scene, they found the young women's vehicles parked perfectly outside in the driveway and on the street.
Inside the home, they found their jewelry taken off and placed on counters, their purses resting on the floor, and their car keys safely set down.
But there is one specific detail that always stands out to me. Investigators found recently used makeup wipes discarded in the bathroom trash can.
The mundane nature of makeup wipes is just so telling. It suggests they felt entirely safe. They were not ambushed the second they opened the door.
No, not at all.
They were comfortable, they were settling in, and they were actively, methodically preparing for sleep.
You are identifying exactly what forensic teams call the state of rest.
Right.
The presence of used makeup wipes, neatly placed personal items, and discarded jewelry indicates a successful period of decompression. They had officially concluded their evening.
The scene prior to the disappearance projects an atmosphere of routine domestic safety.
There is absolutely no physical evidence to suggest they felt threatened, were followed inside, or were in a rush when they initially arrived at the house. They let their guard down entirely.
Which brings us to the morning after, Sunday, June 7.
At 9 a.m., Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, arrived at the house on Delmar Street.
Suzie and Stacy had completely missed their strict 8 a.m. meetup time to head to the Whitewater theme park.
And Janelle was immediately concerned. As she later noted to authorities, Stacy was far too responsible to simply abandon a firm plan without finding a phone and calling to explain.
So when Janelle and Mike physically approach the residence, they immediately encounter the first in a series of highly disturbing clues.
Yes, the front door of the home is unlocked.
Unlocked overnight.
Right. When they step inside, they are greeted by Sherrill and Susie's Yorkshire Terrier, Cinnamon.
And the dog is highly agitated, pacing, and distressed.
You have to evaluate this logically. An unlocked front door overnight in a residence occupied by a single mother and 2 young women is a severe deviation from normal security protocols.
It suggests either a massive oversight or that someone left the home under extreme duress without the opportunity to secure the lock behind them.
Exactly.
There was also a bizarre physical anomaly right outside the front door. The glass globe that covered the porch light fixture was completely shattered, and the shards of glass were scattered across the porch.
Yet the delicate filament and the light bulb itself remained perfectly intact and functional.
And this leads to a moment that I can only describe as shaking an etch-a-sketch before you've had a chance to look at the drawing.
That's a great way to put it.
Mike Henson, seeing the broken glass on the porch and noting that his girlfriend Janelle was walking around barefoot, grabbed a broom and simply swept the glass away.
It was an entirely well-meaning gesture. He was just a boyfriend trying to protect his girlfriend's feet.
But that simple, chivalrous act inadvertently destroyed what might have been the absolute most crucial physical evidence of a struggle or a forced entry outside the home. It's like a tragic butterfly effect.
It is a textbook, agonizing example of crime scene contamination occurring long before anyone actually realizes a crime has taken place.
He altered the resting state of the glass shards.
Right. When a forensic team approaches a broken object, the distribution pattern of that glass is a map. It could have told investigators the exact angle of an impact, the specific kind of force or weapon used, or whether the break was intentional.
Like an abductor trying to plunge the porch into darkness.
Exactly. Or it could have been accidental during a struggle. But by sweeping it into a neat pile, the physical narrative of how that globe broke was irreversibly erased.
While Janelle and Mike were inside the eerily empty house trying to figure out what to do next, the telephone rang.
Janelle picked it up and answered.
The caller was an unidentified male making deeply harassing, inappropriate statements with heavy innuendo. Uncomfortable, she hung up the receiver.
The phone rang again, almost immediately. It was the same individual saying similar things, and she hung up again.
A third call came in with the exact same result. The police later reviewed her statements, and she described the caller's voice as sounding young, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s.
This sequence of phone calls requires very careful interpretation. Janelle recalled that Suzie had actually complained about receiving harassing prank calls at the residence ever since moving in with Sherrill earlier that spring.
So the investigative dilemma is twofold. Were these calls merely a continuation of juvenile, localized harassment, entirely coincidental to the fact that 3 women had just vanished?
Or, far more ominously, was this the perpetrator calling back to test the waters?
What do you mean by testing the waters? How would a perpetrator use a phone call like that?
It is a known surveillance tactic. If an abductor had forcibly taken women from the home hours earlier, they might call the residence later that morning to listen to who answers.
To see if the police are there yet.
Exactly. Does a police officer answer the phone? Does a panicked relative answer? Or does it just ring endlessly? It allows the perpetrator to remotely gauge the response time of law enforcement without physically returning to the location.
Wow, that is chilling. So Janelle and Mike, finding no sign of their friends and thoroughly disturbed by the bizarre phone calls, decided to leave the house.
Assuming the girls had just left early, they actually went to the local water park themselves.
We then transition from the mild confusion of friends to the escalating sheer primal panic of a mother. Several hours pass. Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, realizes her daughter is entirely unreachable.
She begins calling friends who know employees at Whitewater and eventually confirms that the girls never arrived at the park.
Driven by a mother's intuition that something is terribly inherently wrong, Janice drives directly to 1717 East Delmar.
And when Janice McCall enters the residence, she observes the artifacts of disappearance in a state of suspended animation.
She is immediately greeted by the family dog, Cinnamon, who she described as going crazy, just yipping, crying, and clearly traumatized by whatever had occurred in the house.
And she moves methodically from room to room. She finds all 3 women's purses sitting together on the floor of Susie's bedroom.
And Sherrill Levitt's purse still contained a bank deposit of almost $900 in cash from her work at the salon.
That is a massive red flag. Robbery, in the traditional sense of an intruder seizing readily available high-value items, can almost immediately be ruled out.
Right, an opportunistic burglar does not leave $900 sitting in an open purse.
Exactly. Janice also found Stacy's clothes neatly folded from the night before.
These were the only clothes Stacy had in her possession, besides the ones on her back. The only items unaccounted for in the entire house were Stacy's shirt and her underwear.
There was an unfinished can of Coca-Cola left sweating on a nightstand.
And then there were the cigarettes. Both Sherrill and Susie's cigarettes and lighters were left behind inside the house.
We noted earlier that Sherrill was a dedicated chain smoker. The behavioral weight of this specific clue cannot be overstated in a missing persons case.
Because it's a habit.
Right. Individuals in a state of sudden, forced departure do not have the luxury of time to grab their habitual comforts. But if they leave voluntarily, even in an absolute rush or an emergency, a chain smoker reflexively grabs their cigarettes and their lighter.
It is muscle memory.
It is. The fact that the cigarettes, the car keys, the purses, and the large sum of cash were all left behind forcefully indicates that whatever caused these three women to leave the house, it was entirely coercive, unexpected, and immediate.
They did not leave, they were taken. There is also a visual detail in Susie's bedroom that is incredibly haunting. The television was powered on, displaying only the static snow of an empty channel.
This suggests that a movie had finished playing on a VHS tape, the VCR had stopped, and the TV was simply left running for hours.
And resting right there on the headboard of the bed was a copy of the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go.
It is a heartbreaking juxtaposition.
It really is. You have a book that is universally gifted at graduations, meant to serve as a symbol of a bright, limitless future, resting mere inches away from the exact spot where two young women had their futures entirely erased.
The physical environment of the house reflected a violent interruption of normal life. Investigators noted an awkwardly bent window blind, as if someone had peeked out or been pushed against it.
The new waterbed looked slept in, the static on the television droned on.
These are the unmistakable hallmarks of an environment that was securely occupied one moment and vacated the next, without any of the procedural shutdowns of a household.
You turn off the TV, you grab your purse, you let the dog out. None of that happened.
None of it.
And while Janice is frantically trying to make sense of this deeply confusing scene, she uses the home's telephone to officially report the women missing to the Springfield police.
After placing that harrowing call, she notices the blinking light on the home's answering machine.
She decides to check it, hoping for a clue. She listens to a message. She later described it to authorities as a strange message.
But in the frantic process of listening to it, the message is inadvertently erased.
Today, in our modern era of redundant cloud backups, digital permanence, and recovering deleted files, losing a piece of audio evidence like this is unthinkable. Walk us through the fragility of 1990s technology. How does a vital clue just vanish into thin air?
Well, we have to place ourselves firmly in the technological context of 1992 telecommunications. Answering machines of that era utilized analog microcassette tapes, or in some newer models, solid-state memory with extremely limited data capacity. The default setting on many of these machines was what we call a single-play protocol. To conserve precious tape space, the machine would play a new message. And unless the user physically pressed a specific save button during or immediately after playback, the machine would automatically rewind.
And just queue up to record over that exact segment of magnetic tape the next time a call came in?
Exactly. It was a mechanism of physical finality. An accidental erasure was instantaneous, absolute, and irreversible.
So Janice McCall, operating in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, trying to find her daughter, pressed a button or let the tape rewind, and the magnetic sequence was gone forever.
And the police later stated they believed that specific lost message may have contained a vital clue, entirely distinct from the juvenile harassing prank calls Janelle had answered earlier.
By the time the Springfield Police Department fully realized the gravity of the situation and dispatched detectives, roughly 16 hours had passed since the women were last heard from.
And during that massive 16-hour window, the crime scene was subjected to catastrophic contamination.
Between 10 and 20 friends and family members had been inside the house at various points. They were waiting for news, and while waiting in that anxious state, they started tidying up.
They washed dirty coffee cups in the sink, they emptied ashtrays into the trash, they fluffed pillows, and they moved personal items around.
This is where we must look at the human instinct to establish order in the midst of an uncontrollable crisis. When people are faced with overwhelming anxiety and a terrifying situation they cannot solve, they often resort to controlling whatever small things they can.
Usually their immediate physical environment. Cleaning a kitchen counter, washing a dish, or emptying an ashtray is a coping mechanism. It gives the hands something to do.
However, from a strictly forensic standpoint, it is an absolute disaster.
Oh, completely. By introducing multiple new sets of fingerprints, mixing DNA profiles across surfaces, and literally washing away trace evidence like saliva on a coffee cup or ash patterns in a tray, these well-meaning friends and family members severely hindered the investigation.
They inadvertently sanitized a potential crime scene before a single strip of yellow police tape could even be deployed.
They did.
So if the physical evidence is compromised, if the glass is swept up, the DNA is washed away, and the audio tape is erased, how do detectives even begin to build a suspect list? They were operating at a severe disadvantage, forced to turn away from hard forensics and look towards circumstantial suspects.
Right.
How do you start pointing fingers when you have no physical proof?
When you lack physical evidence, you rely on behavioral profiles, proximity, and motive. You start with the concentric circles around the victims.
You look at their inner circle, their acquaintances, and known local offenders, and then you expand outward to transient threats.
It is a painstaking process of elimination based on alibis and opportunity.
Let's examine the faces that emerge from the shadows of this investigation based on those circles. The first is a young man named Dustin Rekla. He was Suzie Streeter's ex-boyfriend, placing him firmly in that inner circle.
And his backstory involves a detail that is incredibly macabre.
A few months before the disappearance, Rekla and two friends broke into a Springfield mausoleum. During this late-night break-in, they vandalized a crypt and actually stole $30 worth of gold fillings directly from a human skull.
The very nature of that crime indicates a profound disregard for societal norms, physical boundaries, and the sanctity of life.
But the critical relevance to this specific missing persons case is not just the bizarre, morbid nature of the theft, is it?
No, it is the legal implication it created. Suzie Streeter knew about the crime. She had actually given investigators a formal statement regarding this mausoleum break-in.
It was widely rumored in their social circles that she was positioned to be a probable witness against Rekla in criminal court.
That provides a concrete, undeniable motive. Silencing a witness is one of the oldest motives in the criminal playbook.
Furthermore, investigators noted that Rekla and the two friends who assisted him in the mausoleum robbery were known to be together and in the immediate Springfield area on the very night the women vanished.
Yes, the presence of a strong motive, combined with geographic proximity and a demonstrated history of criminal behavior, legitimately elevated him as a primary suspect. Law enforcement spent significant time verifying his whereabouts.
But having a motive and the opportunity does not necessarily equate to having the operational capacity to successfully pull off the crime, right?
Yeah, exactly. Abducting 3 adult women from a residential neighborhood, controlling them simultaneously, and removing them without leaving a trace of a struggle or a drop of blood requires a high degree of criminal sophistication.
That perfectly sets up our next suspect, because this is a man who absolutely possessed that terrifying operational capacity, Larry Dwayne Hall.
He is a suspected serial killer with a horrific, highly organized modus operandi.
He traveled extensively around the Midwest, utilizing historical Civil War reenactments as a cover to move seamlessly from town to town in a van.
Authorities believe he abducted, assaulted, and murdered dozens of girls and women over a period of years. And on the specific weekend of June 6, 1992, Hall was right there in the area.
The geographical correlation here is incredibly significant. Wilson's Creek National Battlefield, a major historical site, is located just 5 minutes away from the Kirby residence in Battlefield, where the girls were partying before they found the house too crowded.
Furthermore, there were 2 specific Civil War battle reenactments occurring on the morning and afternoon of June 6 in Pleasant Hope, Missouri,
which is only 30 minutes north of Springfield.
Hall's confirmed presence in the immediate vicinity during the exact window of the disappearance aligns perfectly with his established predatory patterns.
The investigation into Larry Hall actually took a dramatic turn involving a former FBI operative named Jimmy Keene.
Yes, Keene was tasked with a highly dangerous mission, going undercover as an inmate, befriending Hall in a high-security prison for the criminally insane, and slowly gaining his trust.
Hall allegedly admitted to specific, graphic details about many of his crimes during these conversations, details that only the true perpetrator could have known.
And during this undercover operation, Keene discovered something incredible. He found that Hall had created a physical map in his cell, detailing the hidden locations of his victims across the Midwest.
But in a devastating turn of events, before Keene could secure the map or alert his handlers, his cover was blown. He was removed from the prison for his own safety, and the map was permanently lost, presumably destroyed by Hall.
The loss of that map is widely considered one of the great tragedies of modern investigative history. It was the key to dozens of cold cases.
When you analyze Hall's suspected victimology, a chilling pattern emerges. Nearly all of his accused murders occurred in the months of March, June, August, and September, spanning from 1980 all the way to 1994.
Which perfectly correlates with the seasonal timing of his historical reenactment schedule. The Springfield Three disappeared in early June of 1992.
Hall represents the terrifying archetype of the calculated, transient predator. He utilized crimes of opportunity, snatching vulnerable women while operating under a structured, perfectly legal cover that allowed him to disappear across state lines by morning.
So you have the ex-boyfriend with the motive, and you have the transient serial killer with the perfect cover. But there was another prominent name in the case files. Robert Craig Cox.
He is a convicted kidnapper and robber who eventually ended up imprisoned in Texas, and he was also a prime suspect in a separate, violent Florida murder. We have to analyze his ties to Springfield in 1992.
Right. When initially interviewed by detectives, Cox told investigators he was with his girlfriend at church on the Sunday morning after the women disappeared.
She initially corroborated this story, but later, under further questioning, she completely recanted her statement, officially telling police that Cox had explicitly forced her to lie to provide him with an alibi.
The recantation of a solid alibi by a romantic partner is a massive, glaring red flag in any criminal investigation. It demonstrates a clear consciousness of guilt.
It shows a willingness to manipulate, intimidate, and use others to obstruct justice.
After the girlfriend recanted, Cox changed his story, claiming he was actually at his parents' home the night of the disappearance, an alibi his parents subsequently supported.
But what makes Cox particularly notable and highly frustrating for investigators is his subsequent behavior regarding the case once he was behind bars for other crimes.
Yes, his behavior from prison is deeply disturbing.
In 1997, speaking from his cell, Cox began playing a chilling, calculated game with journalists and law enforcement.
He explicitly stated that he knew for a fact the 3 women had been murdered, that they were buried, and that their bodies would never be recovered by police.
He told authorities and reporters that he would only disclose what happened to them after his own mother passes away, supposedly to spare her the grief of knowing what her son had done.
We must carefully evaluate the claims of Robert Craig Cox against the physical evidence. Is he a true perpetrator holding on to the ultimate secret? Or is he simply an opportunist seeking notoriety?
That's the real question. Incarcerated individuals, particularly those exhibiting highly narcissistic traits, often attach themselves to high-profile, unsolved cases.
It grants them leverage, it ensures a steady stream of media attention, and it provides a perverse sense of power over the authorities and the victims' grieving families.
Law enforcement agencies have openly expressed significant doubt about his credibility, recognizing that his elaborate claims might simply be a cruel fabrication designed entirely to stroke his own ego and stay in the headlines.
We also have to look at one more suspect, Gerald Carnahan. He represents a completely different type of threat. He has deep, dark roots in the local community.
Carnahan was eventually convicted for the brutal 1985 murder of a woman named Jackie Johns, though it took a staggering 15 years of investigative work to finally secure that conviction.
He had a long documented history of violent offenses, including an attempted abduction of another young woman years after the Jackie Johns murder.
Carnahan's profile is that of an entrenched local predator. He knows the back roads, he knows the community, and he knows how to hide things in his own territory.
Furthermore, the police files heavily note his associations with the Galloping Goose motorcycle gang.
This connection introduces a potential organized crime element to the theories. Specifically, a convicted offender and police informant named Stephen Garrison, who was closely associated with the gang, provided police with information regarding the 3 missing women.
The police stated at the time that Garrison's information appeared highly credible, though despite extensive searches, it never led to a physical resolution.
So we have this intense tension between the different categories of suspects. On one hand, you have the calculated, transient serial killer like Larry Dwayne Hall, whose proximity, MO, and timeline fit perfectly.
On the other hand, you have local violent offenders like Gerald Carnahan or Dustin Rekla, who have direct ties to the area, the victims, or the local geography.
And then you have the manipulators like Robert Craig Cox, injecting themselves into the narrative for leverage. When traditional detective work stalls against this complex wall of circumstantial suspects and no one confesses, investigations often veer into the unconventional.
And that shift leads to some of the most agonizing dead ends in true crime history.
When the physical evidence is irreparably compromised and the massive suspect pool yields no definitive physical links, law enforcement and the public alike begin to grasp at any available thread.
This shift toward unconventional, sometimes bizarre leads, is born out of sheer desperation to find answers when logic has failed.
One of those threads appeared on December 31st, 1992, exactly on New Year's Eve, just 6 months after the disappearance. A man called the national hotline for the television program America's Most Wanted.
He told the operator he had specific information about the Springfield women.
But right as the switchboard operator attempted to link the caller directly with the Springfield detectives working the case, the call disconnected.
The police publicly stated they believed this specific caller had prime knowledge of the abductions based on what little he said before hanging up. They made public appeals, begging him to call back. He never did.
We must analyze the mental state of a tipster who gets cold feet at the very last second.
This is an individual who carries an immense burden of knowledge. Perhaps he was an unwitting accomplice, perhaps he was a confidant the perpetrator drunkenly confessed to, or perhaps he was a terrified eyewitness.
The overwhelming compulsion to confess or share the information drives him to pick up the phone and dial a national hotline.
But the moment the reality of law enforcement involvement becomes imminent, the exact moment the switchboard attempts to patch him through to the actual detectives who will ask for his name and location, self-preservation violently overrides his conscience.
He hangs up the receiver. That silent disconnect represents one of the most agonizing, frustrating missed opportunities in the entire 30-year investigation.
As the years dragged on and these leads fizzled out, the harsh legal realities of the case began to set in for the families.
In 1997, 5 years after they vanished into the night, Sherrill Levitt and Suzie Streeter were legally declared dead. Yet the Springfield Police Department maintains their files firmly marked as missing.
It is a bureaucratic contradiction that reflects the terrible limbo the families are forced to endure. The declaration of legal death is a necessary, albeit painful, civil procedure.
Probate law requires it. It allows families to finally settle estates, close dormant bank accounts, transfer property, and handle the endless administrative tasks of a life left behind.
But the police designation of missing confirms that the criminal investigation remains active and open. Without physical remains to examine, the state cannot conclusively prove a homicide occurred.
Even when all logic, evidence, and common sense dictate that a triple murder is the only possible reality.
Exactly.
That desperate search for physical remains led to a massive, highly publicized development in 2007. It centered around the south parking garage at Cox Hospital, right there in Springfield.
A dedicated crime reporter named Kathy Baird received a tip claiming that the women were murdered and their bodies were buried deep in the concrete foundation of that very garage.
Baird took this seriously. She invited a mechanical engineer named Rick Norland to scan a specific corner of the parking structure using ground-penetrating radar.
What he found made headlines across the country. The radar detected 3 distinct anomalies beneath the solid concrete.
Norland stated they were roughly the same size and were highly consistent with a gravesite location. 2 of the anomalies were parallel to each other, and the third was perpendicular, lying right across the top of them.
To understand why this caused such a sensation, we need to understand the technology. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, is a highly legitimate geophysical method. It uses radar pulses to image the subsurface.
Right. It detects changes in the dielectric permittivity of the soil, meaning it registers when solid earth gives way to empty space, disturbed soil, or foreign objects.
The identification of 3 human-sized anomalies, clustered together in an investigation specifically searching for 3 missing women, is an incredibly compelling data point.
However, the interpretation of radar data is highly specialized and notoriously tricky.
Anomalies can be caused by various factors, including leftover construction debris, natural changes in soil density, tree roots, or buried utility trenches.
Despite the engineers' findings and the massive media uproar, the Springfield Police Department issued a strong, definitive rebuttal. They entirely dismissed the radar results and refused to dig.
Their reasoning was multifaceted. First, they cited the hard timeline. Construction on that specific hospital parking garage did not begin until September 1993, which is more than a full year after the women disappeared.
Second, they cited the immense financial and structural cost of tearing up a functional, multi-story hospital parking garage.
And third, a former assistant prosecutor revealed a damaging detail. The original tip directing the reporter to the garage came from someone claiming to have had a psychic vision or a dream about the bodies being there.
The police response here highlights their strict adherence to evidentiary standards and logistical realities.
A construction timeline that begins 15 months after the disappearance severely undercuts the theory that the bodies were deposited into the fresh foundation during the initial crime.
The logistics of a killer secretly storing 3 human bodies for over a year and then somehow infiltrating a busy commercial construction site at a hospital to bury them unnoticed are highly improbable.
Furthermore, law enforcement agencies operate on probable cause. They do not secure search warrants from judges, nor do they allocate massive municipal budgets based on psychic visions.
I have to question the tension here, though.
Yeah.
I understand the timeline issue, but you have immense public pressure to dig. You have highly calibrated machine operated by a credentialed engineer showing 3 human-sized anomalies clustered together beneath the concrete.
It's a tough situation.
If you were law enforcement, How do you justify walking away even if the tip originated from a dream? Doesn't the sheer impossible coincidence of three anomalies warrant bringing in a core drill just to definitively rule it out and give the families peace of mind?
It places the department in an incredibly difficult position. The intense tension lies between public expectation, which demands immediate action based on emotional resonance and coincidence, and investigative protocol, which strictly requires legal probable cause.
Right.
Core drilling into the structural load-bearing foundation of a multi-story hospital garage is not a simple afternoon endeavor. It requires extensive engineering surveys, structural reinforcement, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in municipal funds.
If the drill compromises the foundation, the entire structure could be condemned.
The police ultimately determined that an unverified psychic tip, directly contradicted by the known construction timeline, simply did not meet the legal or logical threshold to justify the destruction of public infrastructure. They have maintained for years that the lead is not credible.
And that agonizing decision brings our journey from the frantic, confused days of 1992 into the somber reality of the present. Today, in 2026, the case of the Springfield Three remains totally unsolved.
Over the past 34 years, the Springfield Police Department has processed upward of 5,000 individual tips from the public.
5,000 pieces of information, leads, alleged sightings, and theories, none of which have brought Sherrill, Suzie, or Stacy home.
The passage of 34 years without a resolution creates a profound, lingering generational trauma within a community.
The case has inevitably shifted from an active, hot pursuit into a historical mystery, yet the open wounds remain agonizingly fresh for the surviving family members.
Processing 5,000 tips demonstrates an unrelenting, commendable dedication by law enforcement. But it also highlights the overwhelming volume of noise, rumors, and false leads that can bury the actual truth in a high-profile, heavily publicized case.
Sifting through that much data is like finding a needle in a field of haystacks.
It really is.
In the absence of a grave, in the absence of answers, the community had to find a way to honor them. In June 1997, on the 5-year anniversary of their disappearance, a memorial bench was dedicated to the three women.
It sits quietly inside the victim's memorial garden in Springfield's Phelps Grove Park.
The dedication of a physical memorial serves a vital function for a grieving community. When there are no physical remains recovered, there is no funeral.
There is no cemetery plot for the mothers to visit. There is no closure.
The creation of a dedicated space in Phelps Grove Park provides a localized, tangible point for mourning and reflection.
It anchors the memory of the women in the physical geography of the city, ensuring their names and their faces are not forgotten, even as time and new generations push forward.
The memory of the women has also been sustained through massive ongoing media impact. The case has deeply permeated the true crime cultural landscape.
It has been featured on major national television broadcasts like 48 Hours and America's Most Wanted.
It was the subject of a detailed, highly viewed episode on the series Disappeared, and more recently, in 2021, journalist Anne Roderick Jones launched a multi-part audio documentary series titled The Springfield Three, A Small-Town Disappearance.
That series brought the intricate details of the case to a whole new generation of listeners, examining new perspectives, interviewing forgotten witnesses, and keeping the pressure squarely on the investigation.
Media attention is a notorious double-edged sword in unsolved cold cases.
On one hand, it guarantees that the faces of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy remain firmly in the public consciousness. It dramatically increases the likelihood that someone holding vital information, perhaps that tipster from 1992, might finally feel the compulsion to come forward.
On the other hand, national broadcasts can generate a massive influx of well-meaning but utterly useless tips that drain already limited investigative resources.
However, sustained, rigorous journalistic inquiry like the 2021 documentary series often forces a necessary re-examination of old evidence and challenges the established narratives, which is absolutely essential for keeping a cold case viable.
As we conclude this detailed investigation, I find myself repeatedly returning to the image of that house at 1717 East Delmar Street on the morning of June 7, 1992.
It is the eerie, suffocating stillness of it all.
The newly delivered king-sized waterbed, waiting for a teenage conversation that never happened. The clothes meticulously folded for a work shift that would never be attended.
The large sum of cash left sitting untouched in an open purse. The television displaying only the silent static of an ended tape.
And a small dog pacing the floor, the only living creature who witnessed the truth of what came through that door.
It is an environment permanently frozen in the exact moment of a violent interruption. The physical evidence left behind speaks not to a planned departure, nor a runaway scenario, but to an immediate and total cessation of their daily lives.
It is a haunting snapshot of absolute domestic normalcy, violently intersected by the unknown.
It leaves us with a provocative and deeply difficult thought to carry forward. Consider the concept of the corrupted sanctuary.
The home is supposed to be our ultimate safe haven, the one place we control.
Yet, in this case, the very act of friends and family rushing into that sanctuary to provide comfort, to establish order, and to help find answers ended up irreversibly destroying the physical evidence that might have solved the crime.
The makeup wipes, the swept glass, the washed coffee cups, the erased tape. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about our own nature. When crisis strikes our loved ones, how do we possibly balance the overwhelming, immediate human instinct to help with the cold, sterile necessity of preservation? Thanks for listening.